It's my second time to speak at this event. I think Jimmy was maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and when Jimmy Duncan called and said, would you do this, I told the guy who's been doing my scheduling for a long time, I said, if there's any possible way to do this, I want to do it. When I was a freshman member of the Congress, which would have been 20 years ago, they won that 1 year, and maybe that 1 year only, they decided they'd let the freshman Republicans, we were in the majority, be the vice chairman of the subcommittees in a bunch of the committees. And so on the Transportation Committee, Jimmy Duncan was the chairman of the Aviation Subcommittee. And I was the vice chairman of the Aviation Subcommittee. And I'd been the Secretary of State in Missouri, and I'd held some political jobs, courthouse job. I was a county official, and I told a couple of your county officials here tonight, there is nowhere that still builds political parties like courthouses. You know, it's the one place you can go, and if it's possible to solve your problem, the elected officials there are going to do everything they can to solve your problem. If they can't solve it, they're going to do everything they can to let you know they did everything they could to try to solve it. But I've never been in a legislative body before, never been in a hearing as a member of the committee, so I'm sitting there by Jimmy and just trying to pay all the attention I can. But almost every time, that sometime during the hearing, he'd leave for no other reason than just so this freshman member of the House could preside over the hearing. And just wait till we have the hearing on the guy that was drug off the United Airlines plane in a couple of days. People love the Aviation Committee hearings, no matter what they're about. And here I am 21 years later, I'm the chairman now. I've moved from vice chairman to chairman of the Aviation Committee. It only took me 21 years to get that done. And I still don't know as much about it as Jimmy Duncan. Now, House members, to tell the truth, do specialize a little bit, and they always know more about what they know about than senators do. If you're in a conference committee with senators and House members, the House members always know more, particularly if they're Jimmy Duncan. And there's nobody in this room, or maybe in the country, that knows more about transportation issues than Jimmy Duncan. I told a group just today, I said, look, if you're gonna make something in America today, I think it was yesterday, I'll get back to that in a minute, because I was with the new EPA director, and I'm so pretty excited about that, because I hated the old EPA director. Make something in America today, and people want to make things in the country again. There are lots of reasons. There are a lot of security reasons. There are a lot of reasons, technology. There are a lot of reasons we want to do that. I said, you know, the first two questions you've got to answer is, can you pay the utility bill, and does the transportation system work? And if you can't check both of those boxes, you're not going to get to box 3, which is, okay, if those places, who has the best workforce? And so, you know, as we try to take advantage of that really important asset of transportation, nobody's going to be more important in that conversation than Congressman Duncan is. You know, world food demand, by the way, from where you and I live, Missouri and Tennessee, world food demand is going to double in one working lifetime. The biggest area of commerce in the world will be twice as big 34 years from now as it is today. And nobody is better at this than we are. Nobody's better at this than we are as a country, but nobody's better than this than where we are in the middle of the country. You know, the Mississippi River Valley is the biggest contiguous piece of agricultural ground in the world. Got the best ag research institutions, public and private, the best farmers and ranchers, and maybe more importantly, and back to transportation, the best way to get things all over the world, everywhere in the world. And we've got lots of opportunities. Back to Lamar's view of, we've got more things to be hopeful about than we do to be sorrowful about, and particularly after the results of the last election. But the Hillbilly Caucus, you'd be pleased to know we have no officers and no agenda. That's part of the Hillbilly determination to not have any of those things. You'd also be pleased to know, actually, the 4 of us probably get just about as much done as any 4 people in the Senate. We meet every month. We talk about what kind of common sense things we need to be doing and get done. Turns out we're all appropriators, and since Lamar mentioned we were spending more money on healthcare research than we had in a long time. To do that, we eliminated, in the 2 years we've been in the majority of the Senate, 31 programs that were spending over $1 billion a year.
Wow.
You know, it's not that the Democrats are opposed to anything, it's just they're for everything. And if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And so Ronald Reagan said the nearest thing to everlasting life on earth was the federal government program. Well, 31 of them know that's not actually true anymore. And there are plenty more that need to go the direction that those 31 programs went in. But knowing what your priorities are, establishing your priorities, knowing what you can get done. Lamar mentioned going from East Tennessee to Southwest Missouri, not that culturally different. Actually, I think every single member of my family, at whatever great level of grandfather and grandmother they were, all lived in East Tennessee until about 1830. And they all went to Missouri. So if you're a Mathis or a Whitehead or a Blunt or an Alexander, you're gonna have to start again claiming you're not related to me in any possible way, because those were, and some of them stayed, I assume, and some, I met the commissioner tonight, and Lamar, so I mentioned Lamar today, I said, my family, my great-great-great-grandfather, Hamilton Hezekiah Alexander, came to East Tennessee from eastern North Carolina, and Lamar immediately made the point that he thought for sure his Alexanders came down the Appalachian Mountains from Pennsylvania, which was a pretty subtle way of letting me know that even though I had some Alexander ancestors, they were not the real Alexanders. And we thought, it was really a good decision. I think what all of them thought when they left was that we're not going to be able to compete with the Duncans and the Alexanders and whoever. If we're going to amount to anything, we've got to get out of Tennessee and get somewhere where the competition isn't quite so great. So that is what we did. Lamar also mentioned the inauguration, and I did have the chance, and thank goodness we were inaugurating Donald Trump instead of the other person we could have been. I have found the best possible coping mechanism on a day where things aren't going right in Washington, and there are several of those, as you can imagine. And when I'm feeling, boy, this could be so much better than it is today, I just think Mrs. Clinton could be president. And I'm immediately, I can't think through that without smiling. Could be president. But that, as Senator Alexander mentioned, by the way, your two senators, Senator Corker and Senator Alexander, both, they're involved in so many issues, they're knowledgeable about so many issues, but they both play an outsized role in the issues that they're most involved in. Bob Corker, all the time thinking about our foreign policy, thinking about the dangerous things that are happening in North Korea, thinking about what we should have done, and he said we should have done, as Lamar and I did, in Syria years ago, commenting and praising the president on that quick decision he made. Sometimes how you make a decision is more important than the decision. If the president had done the same thing 3 weeks later instead of 2 days later, it wouldn't have sent nearly the same message to the world as when he saw what Assad had done, understood that we're party to lots of treaties and agreements on chemical warfare, and maybe even beyond that, we already embarrassed ourselves before the world by saying we're going to do something if you do this and then not done it. But the president's immediate reaction was, I think, a significant indication of not only his ability to make a decision, but the people he surrounded himself with to help make that decision. And one of the things you're seeing in the Senate right now is we have an obligation that Jimmy and I didn't have when I was in the House, and Jimmy doesn't have now, the personnel policy of getting people into these jobs to turn the government around. That puts a little more obligation early on the House members because we have to confirm the cabinet. And by the way, a bunch of these cabinet members got confirmed by 52 votes. If they'd taken 60 votes, they probably wouldn't do the job that they're doing right now. They got the votes they needed to get the job, and now they're doing what they need to do to get the job done. But Bob on those, Senator Corker on those foreign policy issues, Senator Alexander on issues, and again, he sits right by me on the appropriating committee that I chair, and we're eliminating programs. We're setting priorities. And health research, before we took charge of that committee, health research hadn't had any increase in 12 years. So if you had no increase, down, about 22% of buying power below what you've been, and why does that matter? Well, the federal government's already spending $250 billion a year on Alzheimer's care. That's just one example. $250 billion a year. The National Institute of Health, we asked them a couple of years ago to estimate where we're going to be if things don't change on this topic of Alzheimer's in 2050. They said, well, we'll be spending in today's dollars $1.1 trillion. Now, billion, 250 billion, that's just all a lot of money still to me. But let me give you what that really means. $1.1 trillion is twice the defense budget. So I don't really have much of an idea what $1.1 trillion is, but I can get in my mind every military base everywhere in the world, including all the bases in here, all of our bases everywhere in the world, every ship, every plane, every uniform, every training dollar, every paycheck for every soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, person in the National Guard, the Coast Guard, the reserves. That's half of what we'd be spending on Alzheimer's if we don't figure out some way to solve this problem. And by the way, this is that rare disease where the caregiver is much more impacted by the disease than the person that has it. And by the way, I'm constantly told that if we're spending 250 billion tax dollars every year on Alzheimer's care, that for every tax dollar we're spending, 2 private dollars being spent, and almost never insured. And if you kind of run through your mind, any family you know who's dealing with this, suddenly, so you've got to be willing to prioritize. You've got to be willing to say, okay, we've got to find a solution here because there's an unmanageable problem if we don't. And it's the right thing to do on top of that. And again, all you have to do is look at families dealing with this to know that. But nobody is more knowledgeable on the programs that aren't working or the programs that need to do a little more, whether it's ag research or health research, than Senator Alexander is. We were out at Oak Ridge today, and the thing that Senator Alexander wanted to know the most about was, didn't you all have a program you tried out a few years ago to see how we could eliminate the waste and the fraud and the duplication in Medicare and Medicaid? And they, oh yeah, we had that, and it really worked really well, so the Obama administration quit doing it. So we were talking today, we're gonna go see the person that runs the part of Medicare and Medicaid that deals with CMS, that deals basically with hospitals. We're gonna go to her office and see her and say, we'd like you to explain to these 2 United States senators any justifiable reason why the Trump administration doesn't wrap its arms around something we know is gonna work, and the Obama administration didn't wanna do it. This is an unbelievable time of great opportunity, I think, in the country. The inauguration, I want to talk about that just a little bit, because the odds of you being in a place where you got to be the chairman of the inauguration and for 7 months wonder, okay, how are we going to get 250,000 people through the security? I mean, our government is never more vulnerable, in my view, than it is at that moment. You're outside, you've got the president, the vice president, the president-elect, the vice president-elect, the Supreme Court, most of the Congress, the new cabinet, every former president that could possibly be there. You're outside on tons of plywood and lumber, and you're as vulnerable as you could possibly be. And so the Wednesday before the inauguration on Friday, we were out there, I was out there with our team, trying to be sure we know exactly what we're doing, it's all gonna work. And mostly that day, we say, okay, how do we get off here in 2 or 3 minutes if we have to? And sort of the last thing I said as we had gone through everything else was, okay, if it's before the president-elect is sworn in, we all know where he's gonna go. You be sure that it's your job, I point to it's your job to see that somebody that can swear him in as president, preferably the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is right behind him. Because if we have anything happen like that, we don't need to have a question as to who the President of the United States is or who should make that decision. And I'll tell you something else, and particularly the last couple of years, I've had the good fortune to have pretty good seats both times. The last couple of inaugurations, George W., every single day of his presidency after 9/11, he had to deal with whatever has to happen today, I've got to make that decision. And the same thing happens with anybody who's president, but I sort of think personally, maybe the most amazing moment there is not the new guy who says, I will, but I found myself looking both 8 years ago and 8 weeks ago at the person who up until that minute, if a decision had to be made, had to make the decision, and then their only decision they have to make is how to get to their car and go where they're gonna go next. I can almost see with George W., of course you see this time, he is he's a good man. And not to bear that burden for 8 years, looks a little older, but he sure doesn't seem like he's older. But you can almost see just that burden of responsibility lift, and then we put it on somebody who we don't appreciate as we should. And I'm pretty optimistic about President Trump. He can make a decision. He clearly is curious. He asks lots of questions. There's a learning curve for even a vice president who becomes president, let alone somebody who hasn't been there before. And I think we're seeing lots of good signs that learning curve is working. The people he's appointed to these cabinet jobs. I was at a coal-fired facility in the middle of Missouri yesterday with the new secretary or the new administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. And I told, there was about 500 people there, and I said, I'll tell you, if you'd have told me a year ago that we'd be here today with the guy who'd been leading all of the attorneys general to challenge these rules that courts would say to the administration, no, you don't have the authority to do that. I'd said a year ago, I can't hardly imagine it's going to be that good. But the clean power rule, we're more affected by that than you are. The average Missouri utility bill would have doubled in 10 or 12 years under the clean power rule. And they didn't care. They really didn't care. This is a rule where it would be like, you're the only person that pays your utility bill. You and I pay our own utility bill. If you have a utility bill at work, you pay that. There is no mythical anything that pays your utility bill, and whatever it costs to produce the utilities, they divide it up by kilowatt hour, and however many of those you use, that's what you pay when you pay your utility bill. If the utility bill doubles, I've been telling people I work for the last 8 or 9 months, next time you pay your utility bill, write it out of the checkbook again. Because that's what it's gonna be like 8 or 9 years from now. Write it out of the checkbook again, and it'll be growing toward there every month. And see what would happen to what your family's trying to do if suddenly you have to stop using the cleanest coal-burning facilities in the history of the world or anywhere on the world, because somebody in Washington has decided that we're gonna make a change and we're gonna make it now. Now, I think it's foolish not to figure out how to use this great asset we have of coal. But even if you decided you weren't gonna use it in the future, there'd be a reasonable time when you say, okay, when this is paid for, then you have to do something differently. What they were trying to do with the power rule would have been if, like the CAFE standards on cars and miles per gallon on cars, if they came up with a new miles per gallon rule and said, this is the new miles per gallon rule, and you can't drive any car beginning next month that doesn't meet that miles per gallon rule. And by the way, you have to pay for the car you're not driving, but you also then have to pay for the new car you have to buy, or whatever car you're gonna have to buy that meets the standards. It was so classically the kind of rule-making, out-of-control regulators that didn't care about the impact that they were having had on families. They're much more concerned about what they thought the country ought to look like 30 years from now than whether people had better jobs 30 days and 30 months from now. And I think we're seeing a real focus on the better jobs 30 days and 30 months from now. Then there was another rule called Waters of the U.S. that we're also not gonna do, and this was a rule back in 1846, at the federal level, the word navigable waters started being used, and navigable meant you could move something on it, so it was commerce. So one of the purposes for the Constitution, interstate commerce, federal government has something to do with navigable waters. Well, the Obama administration, after 1846 until 2 or 3 years ago, the Obama administration says, well, navigable water under the EPA, that really means any water that could ever run into any water, that could ever run into any water, that could ever run into any water. That meant every roadside ditch in Knox County. That meant any water that, I several times, Mark saw me do this, I had the Farm Bureau map on an easel over my shoulder when I was talking about how terrible that rule was for Missouri. And in our state, the new definition of navigable water, the one where you potentially would have to go to the EPA for every building permit, whether you were gonna set a utility pole, whether you're gonna resurface your driveway, in our state, only the part of the state that was colored in red would be covered by the new definition of navigable water. And it was 99.7% of the state. Best I can figure out, we had about 0.3% just sinkholes where the water runs right back directly, and that's the kind of nonsense we were seeing. So both Congressman Duncan and Senator Alexander mentioned, we are fighting these rules back. The president is doing what he can with executive orders to undo the old needless executive orders. We had a rule the other day where we didn't have all of our members for it. And so Senator Isaacson, this is the next time you think, these guys really care, are they really trying to do anything? Senator Isaacson, who had back surgery, had a piece of titanium put in his back, and I don't think he had a choice as about when to do it. He was about recovered enough that he could get an air ambulance from Atlanta with his doctor, come to the Senate floor, so that he could cast the 50th vote, so that Vice President Pence could cast the 51st vote, so that people in the legislature in Missouri and Tennessee could decide who they wanted to contract with to provide health services. The only reason that President Obama did this rule, it went into effect January the 18th. I remember the last full day of his administration, January the 19th. Went into effect January the 18th. Mostly so that Planned Parenthood could not be taken off anybody's list of, at least that's the understood reason. But it is off, that rule is repealed. Everything we could look at that they passed late that we could get to under something called the Congressional Review Act, we're trying to repeal. My view is, hey, the country lived without all of these rules for 228 years. The Obama administration lived without them for at least 7 years and 6 months. I think we pretty safely can repeal all of them. If we happen to repeal one that we later decide is okay, we can look at it again. But of course, these are late rules, thoughtlessly, once again piled on people. So getting those regulators under control and the court. There are 104 lifetime federal judge vacancies right now. There hadn't been a federal judge vacancy filled that a Republican senator wasn't for 2 years. And if we did nothing else but fill those vacancies with young, healthy, conservative people who are going to look at the Constitution, and their question is not what should it say, but what does it say, it would have been an unbelievably successful step into the future. You know, I mean, Judge Gorsuch, Antonin Scalia, remember, he served 26 years on the court after the guy that appointed him, Ronald Reagan, left the White House. And 13 years after Ronald Reagan died. I knew Anthony Scalia pretty well, and I liked him, and I don't want this to sound terrible, but he served the country well in life, and frankly, he served the country well in death. Because that vacancy, I think that actual vacancy on the court, our side deciding, one, we're not gonna fill this, we're not even gonna act like we're gonna fill it, we're gonna let the people be heard. The actual vacancy, if you look at polling, maybe as many as 1 out of 5 voters, the reason they cast the vote they cast for the Senate and the White House was knowing that that was how that vacancy was gonna be filled. I don't think we'd be in the majority if that issue hadn't been out there for people to think about. And I don't think Donald Trump would be president, and we should make the most of the opportunity we were given when people had a right to be heard. And that's what happened in that election.